Welcome to Discerning God's Call. What is vocation? I'm Father Frank Donio, Director of the Catholic Apostolate Center. And together with me is Brian Rhude, the Project Coordinator of the Catholic Apostolate Center, and also a member of the USCCB's Young Adult Ministry Advisory Team. Brian also recently wrote an article for the National Religious Vocation Conference's magazine, Horizon. And so we welcome Brian. We're glad to have you.
Thank you, Father.
And so it's really a blessing to be with you today. So what is vocation? And what do we mean by that when we talk about vocation? I think it's a word we throw around in Catholic circles a lot, but what do we mean by it?
Yeah, so the etymology of the word vocation comes from the Latin vocare, which means to call or summon. And when we talk about our vocation, that's exactly what it is. It's a calling from God. And I was thinking about the word summon earlier. And to be summoned is like, a parent will summon their kid when they've done something wrong, or a master will summon a servant. But to have a summons is a bit less blunt.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what it is. It's our vocation is our distinct call from God, and it manifests itself in different ways, based on experience, based on situation and reality. But it's an opportunity that God gives us to enter into deeper relationship with Him. And when you think about what vocation means as a calling, as an individual calling, for the Christian, for the baptized person, it's really quite amazing, because when you strip everything away, when you strip away all the lingo and the jargon, what it says is that God, who is the creator of everything, of heaven and earth, who St. Vincent Pallotti found and deeply internalized as infinite love, has given each and every single one of us as individuals a calling.
Mm-hmm.
That the God of all the universe could care so deeply about us and want us to enter into relationship so deeply with Him. That He's called each and every single one of us. It's beautiful. It really is.
Yeah, and I think when we look at this, sometimes there's a tendency to see it as call to something, which it is. But so how's this connection with vocation and the call to holiness? What was that? How do those two connect up with one another?
Yeah, as for a long time, and you'll still hear it from some people, unfortunately, that vocation, and I said this in the article, that vocation we've had a tendency to kind of pinhole vocation, to say that vocation is only what your state of life is. But what St. Vincent Pallotti said in the mid-19th century, in the 1830s and 40s in Rome, is what the church has expanded upon in the past century, is that each and every single person is called to holiness, is called to be an apostle.
Mm-hmm.
In the language of the church now, we would say they're called to be a missionary disciple.
Mm-hmm.
Not just one that follows, but one that goes out. That was made universal and manifest by the church at the Second Vatican Council.
Mm-hmm.
In Lumen Gentium. We have in a Vatican document this universal call to holiness.
Mm-hmm.
So no longer was vocation limited to, are you going to be a priest or a consecrated religious or married?
Mm-hmm.
But now, no matter which one you're called to, no matter what you do, you are called to holiness. You are called to that following and deepening of intimacy and relationship with God. And they can't be, and that universal call to holiness is what feeds our life.
Mm-hmm.
It's what feeds the church, and it's what feeds the particular vocation, because the development of the church's understanding of the universal call to holiness, that universal vocation, has in no way diminished particular vocations, state of life vocations, but it feeds them. And I think they're intimately connected.
Some people get a little concerned with the word holiness. They and Pope Francis, even in his fairly recent, in the last couple of years, Apostolic Exhortation, Gaudete et Exultate, even talks about living holiness today. And that really is more lived out in everyday life. We're not really talking about, people on prayer cards and stained glass and that type of thing, but really the person living this in their everyday life wherever they might find themselves. And I think that's a piece that sometimes people forget. They hear the word holiness and it can be kind of intimidating in a sense. So, then how then does this understanding of we develop this understanding of vocation then? Because if if we're called to holiness, if we have a call, this call, so how do those two then connect in terms of further in terms of vocation? And what's the development that we've seen, particularly since the Second Vatican Council, with regard to vocation?
Yeah, well, I think it's what we were just talking about, that this idea that vocation, um, it's been expanded, right? And it's not. Um, I think some might even think that how when the church talks about this universal vocation to holiness, that it's somehow reductive to the particular vocation.
Mm-hmm.
But really, what it's saying is echoing the call of many of our great saints and of Jesus himself, and saying, you know, what you choose, what you understand is where God is calling you in your life, um, is a journey. And when you come to understand that call to the best of your abilities, that's great. But what do you do to get there? What do you do during? And I think that's the universal call to holiness. It's that universal vocation that is that which, without our particular vocation, um, I've used the analogy of a shell, really. When I've spoken to youth groups or youth and young adults, all you have to do is think of a priest or religious or a married couple,
Mm-hmm.
or a single person who claims this discipleship, claims even apostleship of the risen Lord, um, but they're without joy, they're without charity,
Mm-hmm.
humility. Um, Without those things, the particular vocation is empty.
Mm-hmm.
So to understand where God is calling us in holiness every day, according to that vocation and according to the place that He has put us in, that He has accompanied us to in His providence, is what sustains that and what animates it.
Mm-hmm. And really, this is all connected also to baptism and confirmation, and the the connection in which we are then baptized into the mission of Christ as priest, prophet, and king, and so that's lived out in everyday life. Now, for you, how have you found that lived out in everyday life? What does that look like?
I mean, it's a journey, and I think that's kind of one of the perceptions of vocation, is that once you find it, everything just kind of
Mm-hmm.
clicks, and it's super easy, um, and everything is a walk in the park from then on. But with that view of vocation that comes from our baptism, there isn't a moment.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a single moment that you can grasp onto, but a continual journeying and a continual movement towards the goal of imitation of Christ and deep
Mm-hmm.
relationship with Him. So, this the vocation to holiness, um, is difficult, but for me, it's been about finding and seeing where Christ has been present in my life. What has been the things, who have been the people that have attracted me to church, to the church and to Christ, and how do I imitate that in a way that's authentic to myself? That's not imitation for the sake of fitting a mold, but of finding the ways that I have been evangelized to, that
Mm-hmm.
I have been accompanied, that I have seen Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and working my hardest to be that, to do that to and with others.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but in a world with so many great difficulties and sufferings and um, realities, that's a challenge. So the challenge is not just to figure out how to do those things, and because if you take a moment and stop and look back on your life, and really prayerfully reflect on that,
Mm-hmm.
those things will begin to appear. The people who have walked with you, the encounters you've had with Christ. The more difficult part is to then, okay, then how do I do that? And how do I do it with perseverance
Mm-hmm.
and with prayer and humility, in remembering that this is a call that we answer. We haven't given ourselves this call,
Mm-hmm.
and we are not going to be the ones to give ourselves meaning or to pull ourselves to our own finish line, but to have the humility to step back and see where God is working and where He has ordained our path. And then in the day to day, to figure out, okay, where is He calling me? How is He calling me to take that step forward on that path?
Mm-hmm. When you were in Rome during the synod on young people, the faith, and vocational discernment, and had an opportunity to speak with some of the American delegation that was there, from the delegation from the States, but also then you were one of two delegates to the post synod forum that occurred then in June of 2019. So in that, how did these things get discussed? What were the ways in which vocation and that discernment piece get discussed?
It, especially in June, the focus of that gathering was really on Christus Vivi.
Hmm.
And
Could you talk a little bit about Christus Vita for people who might not know what that
yeah,
is?
so Christus Vivi is our Holy Father Pope Francis's most recent apostolic exhortation that came out of this period of listening and discernment that was the Synod in 2018. Um, and he writes this, what's really a letter.
Mm-hmm.
He writes this beautiful letter to first young people, but the entire people of God, on the realities of the Christian life, specifically in relation to young people, in talking about vocation and discernment, the realities of young people in this day and age, accompaniment, and doesn't present us with a roadmap. It's not a
Mm-hmm.
map quest, but what it is something that we can, no matter where we are in the country, in the world, um, no matter what our charism, our spirituality, but coming together as baptized, how can we, especially as young people, build up the church by first acknowledging and realizing the relationship that we have to have with the risen Christ. And that's one of the most important points I think that the Holy Father makes in Christus Vivi. Um, he kind of lays out this 3 point reality of who Christ is, right? Uh, Christ died for us, he loves us, and he's alive.
Mm-hmm.
And it's with that reality, like we were just saying, right, that it's not ours, but it's his.
Mm-hmm.
It's with that truth in our hearts that Jesus Christ died and rose for us, that he saves us, and that he is alive, that as young people in his church, that we can then go out and share that message. And the reality was that other than the staff of the dicastery who held this forum, it was all young people from around the world.
Mm.
There weren't a lot of priests and religious. I mean, there were a few religious sisters that were there. Um, so certainly we discussed, how can we increase particular vocations to the priesthood and the religious life and faithful marriage. But really, the questions that so many of my friends and colleagues were asking was, how can I best live holiness, and then how can I share that with the young people in my country?
Mm.
And it was eye-opening to see in many ways that we face a lot of the same realities, but they manifest themselves in different ways. Um, so I mean, one was just the document itself, right? This beautiful document that we just talked about, that you know, one of the delegates from Hong Kong said none of the young people in his country have read the document, have been able to experience this beautiful letter from our Holy Father because it's too expensive for them to afford in paper copy. Um, and for me in the States, the reality is also, yes, many of our young people also haven't read the document, but for a very different reason. And it was the same thing with these discussions about accompaniment and of vocation and of discernment, that it's not that young people have turned their attention away from it. I think it's the exact opposite, that there is a deep desire and a burning to understand where God is calling us and then how to follow that. But the question is then how?
Mm-hmm. And so that really leads us then to the not only the how in a general sense in terms of call to holiness, but then what about those particular vocations? When we talk about particular vocations, state in life, these kinds of things, what do we mean by that as church?
I've come to love this little image, where you have a big V vocation and a little V
Mm,
vocation, uppercase and lowercase, capital and lowercase, however you want to put it. Where the capital V vocation is that particular vocation, that state of life, and in general, the church uh, historically has kind of acknowledged three main ones: the married life,
mm-hmm,
consecrated religious life, and the priesthood. And
mm-hmm,
more recently, especially at this synod, the church has begin a discussion about the single life
mm-hmm,
and its status as a
mm-hmm,
particular vocation. Um, and then you look at the lowercase v vocation, the universal call to holiness. And it's important to acknowledge that the uppercase and lowercase aren't measures of value.
mm-hmm,
We're not putting a value on particular vocation, but in the sense of a proper noun,
mm-hmm,
it's a way of differentiating. Um, so those are our, in general, the 3 to 4, depending on who you talk to, particular vocations that we're talking about: the married life, consecrated religious life, the priesthood, and the single life.
mm-hmm. And our team at Catholic Apostolate Center, we're working on putting together a series of webinars, that this would be the first one, and that there would be a series of webinars about those particular vocations as well. When we look at accompaniment, and you've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and we as a center certainly have been reflecting on it. We have a new resource that's come out called The Art of Accompaniment, which really is taken from Pope Francis's teachings, but also the just really the whole span of the church from the time of Jesus onward, particularly when we look at it. But even in the Old Testament, we see this theme of accompanying people. How do these two pieces interconnect? Would you say the accompaniment and vocation and discernment?
What I say to people, it's, if you want to take it from a scriptural basis, from the very beginning, from the book of Genesis, in the creation of man, um, man has never been alone. When God created Adam, he gave him all of the creatures of the air and the sea and the sky, and it still wasn't enough. And it wasn't until God then made Eve from a bone from his side that there was that sense of completion.
Mm-hmm.
And as you follow the path of human history through the scriptures, even up until now, what you'll find is that very rarely is there that total aloneness.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're talking about God's presence in someone's life, or the presence of other people who witness to God in their
Mm-hmm.
life. Um, you know, when Jesus sent out the apostles, his disciples, he didn't send them out one by one, he sent them out two by two.
Mm-hmm.
And it speaks to the necessity of accompaniment in the spiritual life. When you look at the great saints of the church, St. Francis and St. Clare, St. Francis Xavier and St. Ignatius Loyola, St. Vincent Pallotti and St. Gaspar de Buffalo, you'll see these great spiritual friendships, these great periods of accompaniment that, yes, they're saints, but they weren't always.
Mm-hmm.
These are people who walked together to come to achieve holiness. And and of course, then we know, um, achieve that in the greatest way, that they now find themselves in the eternal banquet with God. Um, so accompaniment really is necessary for proper discernment for various reasons. When we think we can do this alone, you risk also thinking that you can do it without God
True. Yes, very true.
at times,
Mm-hmm.
and then it can become very our discernment becomes turned inward.
Mm-hmm.
We can sometimes cease to be looking to God and turn in and say, well, what's most comfortable, or what do I want? And having someone to accompany, whether that's a mentor, a friend, a spiritual director, any combination of them, um, it allows us to, when we have, in that process, even discerned who are these people in my life that not only I can trust, but have the humility to walk with me in a pursuit of holiness and of God's call,
Mm-hmm.
not of theirs. Um, then you open yourself up to that which is outside of yourself. You open yourself up to the opportunity to have someone witness to Christ to you. Um, and I mean, accompaniment has been a huge part of my life. Um, and when you talk to people, you realize this great desire for relationship. And I think that relationship is really a fulfillment of the human nature and the
Mm-hmm.
nature between God and man. So this accompaniment isn't, in my opinion, can't be secondary to our discernment. We can't do this alone. Um, so then where do we turn? We'll first to God, and then those who help show us Him most clearly in our day-to-day lives.
And I think it keeps us from becoming professional discerners, where we don't take action
Hmm.
of some type. I think some people think, well, no, that means I have to suddenly choose a particular vocation. It's more, how do I make this move that that is more toward a life lived in Christ, that ongoing conversion or metanoia that's so necessary, but that helps me to live this vocation to holiness, the call to holiness, but the vocation that I've received in baptism more fully. And that can be sometimes, I think, a bit challenging for people, because almost there's a paralysis that might come, like, what if I make the wrong move, what if I do the wrong thing, how do I end up kind of backing out of it? And I think there are ways of doing that, and that's where the accompaniment comes in, that if we have people in our lives who that we can speak with honestly, and they can honestly speak with us, that there is that trust that's there, that's born out of the love of Christ for the other, then there can be a calling forth that will cut through that paralysis or the narcissism
Hmm.
that might be there. That's just like, oh, what am I to do, and where am I to go, and that type of thing, which can really, I found, can really paralyze a person if they're not careful, and it really can make for difficulty. So when we use the term vocational discernment, let's talk a little bit more about that. So what do we exactly mean by that?
Discernment is a process, and that's an important thing to keep in mind, that it is a process.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a one-time thing, and we talked about this a little bit earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's a process of prayerfully figuring out, doing your best to figure out
Mm-hmm.
where God is calling you. And again, quite often when we think of the term discernment, of the practice of discernment, um, we think simply of discerning particular vocation.
Yes.
Um, I said to a friend once, I asked them, I was like, "Oh, did you know that so and so is discerning?" And they stopped and they said, "Brian, everyone is discerning. What do you mean?" And it made me pause and made me think that I myself had fallen into that trap,
Mm-hmm.
that I had reduced the idea of discernment simply to a particular vocation. When the reality is, to figure out where God is calling us, to open ourselves to Him, that openness is so key, um, is a process that we undergo not just in figuring out what state of life we're being called to, but how do I live that call to holiness on a daily basis?
Mm-hmm. There's some beautiful sections in Gaudete et Exultate and also in Christus Vivit about discernment and also about vocation that when combined, really, especially the discernment part, when you look at both of those documents together, the apostolic exhortations of Pope Francis, they really give a guide, a beautiful guide for discernment, that can help move us beyond that paralysis that I was talking about a little earlier. So so how when we say it's not one time, um, speak about that a little bit more, in terms of how to go about discernment. How do we get a little practical
Mm-hmm.
related to that?
I think that one-time mentality comes from uh, the the hierarchical mentality of vocation. The particular vocation
Mm-hmm.
is um, has greater value to the Christian life than the call to holiness. In that, when someone receives holy orders, they've received holy orders. When
Mm-hmm.
someone's married sacramentally in the church, they're married. Um, and when you only look at particular vocation separate from the call to holiness, I can see where we would think that it's a one-time thing. Once you've discerned, you've discerned.
Mm-hmm.
But with the call to holiness that every ordained person shares with every married person, with every consecrated religious, that we can't stop discerning once we're ordained or once we're married, because then what do you do the next day
Mm-hmm.
after your ordination or after your wedding? What do you do the next day, the next minutes following, to better strive for that holiness? So it requires us, first off, as I said, it requires a lot of openness, and that's a lot easier said than done, um, because openness to God requires humility and requires a lot of trust to be able to accept that where I think I'm going might not be where He's calling me.
Mm-hmm.
And to have the trust, Jesus called Peter out onto the water to take more than just a couple steps without drowning.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a process. It's a part of that journey to come to that openness. And I think so much of that openness comes in our willingness and ability to be quiet and to
Mm-hmm.
listen. Um, in the first book of Kings, right, we hear that God doesn't come in the giant storm or the earthquake, but His voice is heard in the whisper. Discernment requires, yes, of course, it involves accompaniment. It involves talking. It involves a lot of very active things. One of those being active listening
Mm-hmm.
to where God is calling. And again, silence, much like openness, is something it's a process to get to that point. I was talking with a friend about, well, how do we get more silence, and on a practical level, being intentional about it. um, you know, Someone who is very high energy might not be able to go and sit through an entire hour long holy hour in silence, and that's okay. But to begin taking 30 seconds, a minute, 5 minutes out of your day to be in quiet and to listen for God and to build that over time, um, is a very practical way to open yourself up, and then to not be afraid. Like you were talking about, these continual discerners, these, and to be able to realize that to discern especially a particular vocation, it's not like they board up the door once you've walked through it.
Mm-hmm.
So, to if you're discerning religious life or the priesthood, to go on a come and see weekend, to talk to a vocations director. If you're discerning marriage, to really begin to go through that process, to speak to a priest about it, um, to if you're at that point, to go through pre-cana and to understand that if it comes to the point where you realize that this isn't where God's calling you, it's okay to take a step back.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that leads a person who was very actively and deeply discerning marriage to the priesthood of the religious life, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay. We talked about this in Chicago at the Young Adult Ministry Summit that was a product of the class that I took from you. That, there's a lot of stigma around discernment.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of pressure
There
for
is.
people, especially particular vocation. And one of my classmates was saying, that we need to stop the stigma of someone that discerns, that begins this journey of discernment into a state of life, and then discerns that that's not where God's calling them. To say that someone who is in seminary shouldn't be marked with the scarlet letter of former seminarian
Mm-hmm.
forever, because it's not as though, in most cases, that they've just blindly turned away from God and run to their own desires and inhibitions. But but hopefully they've prayerfully discerned that that's just not where God was calling them.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that requires openness, and it requires the ability to listen
Mm-hmm.
and to be walked with. I think practically, you know, to find someone or someone's multiple people who can walk with you, and who are willing also, as you said, it's not only the ability to share, but to be shared with. To find people in your life who care for your pursuit of holiness, and who are willing to, when push comes to shove. Jesus listened on the road to Emmaus, and he listened and he
Mm-hmm.
listened and he listened, but then he taught. So to have people who are willing to do so, not out of their own pride to fill your cup, but to say, we're walking together on this journey, and you're searching for holiness. Um, but why don't we look here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think when we look at it, when we really look at it closely, we'll see that there are these people who have been with us, even if we think we've been going it alone. And they may be people who are the lives of the saints. They might be people who we maybe have never met in this life, but and will hopefully meet in eternal life. But there have been people accompanying us in the community of faith. I think that base also of that ongoing pursuit of the vocation to holiness and call to holiness and living the baptismal vocation as fully as we can. Once that creates an, an amazing foundation if we start there, and then we move into more fully the particular vocation, and looking at the breadth of the vocation, those which are open to us in as the church provides, that there are those opportunities. And I think, as we look at this, if you would like to ask any questions, or if you would put them in the chat box, and then they'll be fed over to us to for us to have some discussion with. So please put them in the chat box, and John Sitka, our assistant director of programs, who's in our control room at the moment, he's going to be sending them over to me and to Brian, and we're happy to respond to those. But when we look at these particular vocations, which as we talked about are going to be separate webinars, when we say priesthood, and we say consecrated life, and we say the marriage, and then also the single life, when we look at those, I think if we look at priesthood, for example, most people know what a priest is. Consecrated life can be a little bit of a question for you, because they might think simply a monk, or they might think a person who's a mendicant, like a Franciscan or a Dominican. They might think a Jesuit, but they might think somebody who is maybe one of the missionary apostolic communities. There's also then older communities of sisters, like the Ursuline sisters. You have a number of these communities that have come to the fore, of women and men, and all different types of consecration, including people who are lay, people who are married, who belong and now you also have movements and associations. They're not quite consecrated in life, but maybe they share in the charism. For example, in the Palatine family, we're part of the Union of Catholic Apostolate, which includes individual members, and it includes whole communities, such as my own community. It includes lay communities, and so this kind of mix that's there, and of course with marriage, and people who discern, and then single life, which again is this, starting to grow as a greater conversation, and has been actually, I think, for some time, in a variety of circles. So when we look at those, I think it's important for us to look at those particular vocations, but with that foundation that I was talking about. So when we look at the some questions that we have here, where does spiritual direction fit into discernment of vocation? How does it differ from vocational recruitment by a vocation director, if you will?
I think that spiritual direction is um, really a necessity for anyone who is um, actively and deeply discerning a particular vocation. One thing that I wrote in that article for Horizon is that it's a call on priests of a diocese, or priests or brothers who are, or sisters who are acting as and walking with someone, that we have the humility and the freedom to not force someone into a vocation that's not theirs.
Mm-hmm.
That if someone doesn't feel called to your religious order, or your um, community, your diocese, your group, that first off, it's not that we try to convince them, and but it's also not then just that we drop them like, like last
Mm-hmm.
week's garbage. Um, and that's why, I mean, you know, to have a vocations director as a spiritual director, um, can get a bit dicey,
Mm-hmm.
I think. Um, but spiritual direction, to have someone that knows you on an intimate level,
Mm-hmm.
that you can share really the deepest parts of your relationship with God
Mm-hmm.
with, um, I think is very important, because uh, it provides a different viewpoint,
Mm-hmm.
and it allows for a conversation,
Yes.
um, so that it's not just hearing your own voice in your head, um, for whether that's good or bad. Whether your voice is telling you just to do what's easiest, what's most comfortable, or whether the voice in your head is really giving you a tough time, and you can't seem to choose. A spiritual director then allows for the kind of parsing out.
It does, and having been and continue to be spiritual director of people who are, quote unquote discerning, but and I say that because I'm always starting with the aspect of what we've been talking about throughout is this growth in holiness. Then we kind of look at the breadth, and then we take one's time in looking at particular vocation, because usually people look at it almost like career search.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, I've precluded these other ones already, and therefore I have to tease that apart, especially if a person is at a fairly early stage in their spiritual life, and in their spiritual growth, and to step back and say, okay, yeah, you may feel this call to this, but let's look at the whole breadth of things. And there is the difficulty, I think, sometimes in terms of, because the church is in such need of priests and of people in consecrated life, that sometimes there is a bit of a mentality that's not one of accompaniment, but instead it can be one of recruiter, which is unfortunate. I think there is also the need then to properly refer
Mm-hmm.
people. That just like with any kind of referral, that it's not just I feel like I'm dropped, but instead here this person can assist you maybe more fully, and I'll
Right.
continue to pray for you. I'll continue to have maybe some connection with you, but I'm not necessarily your primary person, because there are some ethical things that aren't engaged with that, because you don't want to seem like you're putting being too heavy-handed, but just dropping people is not good either. We have another question, a few questions, in fact. So, from Joe, we have, what are some ways to discuss with friends, priests, lay leaders about discernment being more encompassing than just entering the priesthood or religious life? That's a good question.
It's a good question, and it's an ongoing conversation that so many of us in the church are having, um, and it's not an easy question to answer.
No, no, it's not.
I mean, I think with friends, it's probably easiest once you step out of organized church structure, you know, um, because for me, to have a conversation with my friends, many of them who are discerning particular vocations, um, oftentimes we'll get down to, okay, but how do I be holy? How do I
Mm-hmm.
how do I, in whatever search I'm undergoing and whatever prayerful discernment I'm undertaking, how am I striving for holiness? It's when we're talking within the church structures that I think it gets even stickier, of how to separate that. As a national advisory team, we're having this conversation of, when we look at offices of vocations for dioceses and archdioceses, are we authentic to the name Office of Vocations? Or should we at least begin a conversation of saying, well, if this office isn't going to help people to discern their vocation,
Mm-hmm.
but only one, the vocation of the priesthood, most of the time, then maybe we should be more explicit about that.
Well, and a number of dioceses have.
Yes,
They
Houston
have they
Houston
have
just
they have
changed.
changed, and they say it's Office of Priestly
Hmm.
Vocations, and they're really clear about that. If you are interested in being a priest for the die, and I think that's true. We do need to be clear about what it is we're engaged in. That a person is at a certain point in discernment. I also find that people, even who are discerning consecrated life, for example, by the time they contact a vocation director of religious community, oftentimes they're fairly far along.
Hmm.
It's rare these days because you have people kind of scouring the internet looking at things. They've been talking with lots of different people and so forth. So by the time they get to, sometimes they've made a decision and they don't even know the community, which you have to kind of back up a little
Yeah.
bit because there's a discernment on both
Hmm.
sides. And that's true for priesthood. The same is true for marriage. There's a discernment on both sides. It's not one person discerning that, oh well, I'm marrying you and I see you from afar and here's the ring. I mean that doesn't work that way. But I think that kind of piece, I think that's where the apostolate of accompaniment can really come in, and I think that's one of the reasons why, part of the reason why we proffer it as a center, and when the church has been moving this outward even more, is that that's one of the ways in to assist people in looking, leaders in looking at the broader picture. um, so let's look at one of the other questions here. What are some practical ways you have found silence in your vocational life? What is the thing you focus on when you're trying to practice active listening? This is from George.
Well, so for me personally, um, silence is a difficult thing, and it's something I'm still learning. So, every Lent on campus at the Catholic University of America, we have adoration, every weekday. So there tends to be an excitement from a lot of students to have this opportunity to sign up for a however long, half hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, however long they can give. And so when I first came, I signed up, and it was a lot of like fidgeting and a lot of, okay, well, I got to bring this book and make sure I have my rosary and all this stuff. um so again, I think it's about being intentional in
Mm-hmm.
being honest with yourself and where you are with silence in your spiritual life, and working on it in a way that's progressive,
Mm-hmm.
that isn't saying I'm going to go on a week-long silent retreat
Mm-hmm.
when you struggle with 30 seconds of silence in mass. um, but to then recognize those times when silence can be a part of everyday life too. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's, we can't limit, if we want to cultivate a spirituality that is open to silence, I don't think it can be something that is only for moments when I'm in prayer,
Mm-hmm.
but to find times throughout the day, on a drive home from work, in the morning when you've just woken up, to embrace that silence, um, because then it doesn't seem like this thing that I do when I pray, but it becomes more familiar, and it
Mm-hmm.
becomes, um, not casual, but becomes, a bit more intimate
Mm-hmm.
to the person. Um, that doesn't seem like it's only when I'm in this mode can I be silent. And then I think it becomes easier when you
Over
are
time.
engaging in that prayer than when we've opened our lives to silence, to listen to the voice of God. That when we do find ourselves in those moments in front of the Eucharist, um, before or after Mass,
Mm-hmm.
in times of retreat and reflection, that then we can welcome silence into our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that kind of progressive approach is an important way to go about it. To start small, and then to build from there, but also to look and to see God in everyday life. Pilates' famous quote of "Seek God and you will find God. Seek God in all things, you will find God in all things. Seek God always, and you will always find God." And so God present in those everyday moments, that if we don't silence ourselves throughout the day, or even just stop for a moment and say, "Oh, okay, here's this present." And I think that becomes then the active listening,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not just in those moments where here I am in the chapel before the Blessed Sacrament exposed. That's those are moments that are privileged moments with the Lord, but then God is trying to speak to us then throughout everyday life. Here's another one. So, how have you both gotten to your particular places in your vocation story so far? So here we go, with the personal. I'll give you a little time to think. I could this one I tend to talk about a little bit. And so for myself, it was over the course of a lot of accompaniment in my parish community, where my community of the Palatine Fathers and Brothers were present, where in generations of my family, um, because the community was there for so long. And so it was just part of the family, and there was a community there. There were usually three priests and a brother, or four priests of the community who were present in the parish community, active in the community, and others who would come in and out, including seminarians and students in formation and so forth. And so that became for me really one of the ways, that kind of accompaniment. Also a youth group that was started, but really for me it was also spiritual direction, and that even as a high schooler, and I didn't go to Catholic school. I went to public school, and so the parish community became really that place where I could have those kinds of conversations. The youth group was also a place where that could happen, and being there with the Palatines and working together with them in various projects. But it was the spirituality. So that wasn't just it. It was the accompaniment of Vincent Pilati for me, and that larger vision, which of that all are called to be apostles, and that there is that holiness that is present. But again, even after then looking at that, I looked at marriage. I looked at the variety of vocations, and came to this was where I was called, and did take a bit of a leap at a fairly young age. But even throughout that, there's always that ongoing discernment of where is God, what is God asking me now, asking of me now, not. And when I look back at life and say, oh, here, which I did may not have seen, here's where God has been moving and present and active in a way that I didn't quite expect, and often, and often marvel at. So, and how about for you, Brian?
Well, for it, it's I'm you know we share in that Pilates accompaniment was so important for us. So I didn't really come to know, even recognize Christ in his church until I was a junior in high school, and by God's grace, that high school was St. Vincent Pilates High School in
Mhm.
Laurel, Maryland. And Pope Francis writes, I believe it's in Gaudete Cultate, about the example of holiness in the saints and how it can be the saints who accompany us. Um, and when you combine that with the experience of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize Christ for a long time. He'd walked with them for miles before he broke the bread and they recognized him. When you combine those two realities, you kind of get how Pilates accompanied me to this point. That, I very loosely knew who he was in high school, simply because I wore his name on the breast of
Mhm.
my
Sure.
school shirt
Yes.
every day. And we talked about
It's
him in religion
actually his
class.
signature,
Yes.
in fact.
Yeah. um, but it wasn't until years later that I really understood that he had been kind of watching over me, really,
Mm.
in a very real sense. So I went through high school kind of really figured out that, okay, Christ is this is a real person, and not only that, but someone worth paying attention to. Around my junior year, and things kind of developed. And then when I went off to college for the first time, um, I held on to that desire to know Christ and that desire and that feeling of home in his church, to the point that even though I hadn't received my sacraments of First Communion and confirmation, that I would still attend the local Catholic parish in Cranston, Rhode Island, St. Paul's. And I was just telling a friend, when I was confirmed, I approached the pastor, Father Adam Young, on a cold, snowy day in late November in Rhode Island, and asked him if I could join RCIA, and he, with open arms, him and the community accepted me. Um, when it came time to choose a confirmation saint, really the only one that came to mind was Pilate. And at that moment, it was only because he was the one that I recognized. And it was the accompaniment of those who had taught me at Pilate
Mhm.
High School that had helped me to come to that point of desiring
Mhm.
to enter fully into his church, to get to know him more with more intimacy, and to
Mhm.
follow him and to help others to
Mhm.
see that. So when I chose him, it was really a practical matter. It was that he's the one I recognized, and when I looked back on the previous 4 or 5 years, that it was most obvious that without Pilate, without the school of which holds his namesake, which is sponsored by his sisters, that I wouldn't have been to that point.
Mhm.
But now, 4 years later, looking back, I see that it wasn't just practicality. It certainly wasn't chance.
Mhm.
Um, that it was his intercession, um, and that throughout that whole process, he had continually interceded,
Mhm.
um, because, um, with his choice placed in heaven, he knew uh, of the plan that God had in store that for me was so foreign for so long. Um, and that through the campus ministry and religion department at St. Vincent Pilates, through those people who walked with me and who accompanied me, who never once tried to co-opt me
Mhm.
or tried to make me what they wanted, but
Mhm.
who saw opportunity, an opportunity that was by the grace of God, helped me to see Him
Mhm.
very tangibly, um, but in a way that led me to desire to seek Him more fully. Um, it was really the fact that I'm here is a product of accompaniment, and it was a
Mhm.
product of the accompaniment of those who were physically there around me, and the accompaniment of St. Vincent Pilate, who was interceding for me and walking with me through that process.
And it's changed the whole direction, your whole direction in life. You were studying to be a chef,
Mm-hmm.
and then went back to your first year when you said you're like the second time of college. You went back to freshman year again. You did your associates. Went back to freshman year again at the Catholic University of America. Now you're finishing up a degree in theology and a certificate of pastoral ministry and planning, looking toward pastoral ministry as your life, as a lay ecclesial minister. At least in these years as you've continued to discern your particular vocation. So, I mean, it's really changed kind of the whole direction of
Yeah,
things.
and that's where I think to understand discernment, to understand our vocation. Uh, I mean, I love the quote from Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI from Deus Caritas Est, right? That um, the Christian life is not the result of a
Mm-hmm.
ethical choice or a lofty decision, but of an encounter with a person, an event that gives life a decisive direction
Mm-hmm.
and a new horizon. And for me, that decisive direction came through
Mm-hmm.
accompaniment that allowed me to see that I had a call from God, a God who, for so long of my life, was distant, was foreign, as a concept, as a reality. But you know, that encounter that gave that direction was was through people who saw who saw Christ in me, who allowed me to see Christ in them, and who wanted to walk with me on a journey of holiness. That, yes, first had to start with opening my heart to
Mm-hmm.
God, but then that continual, as you talked about earlier, that metanoia, that continual conversion every single day, that continual yes to get to where I am, that did
Mm-hmm.
require, you know, in what most people would consider quite the 180, going from culinary school to a degree in theology. And I was at a baseball game earlier in the summer, and I was wearing a Catholic University hat and a Johnson and Wales sweatshirt. And the guy at the concession stand looked at me and he said, I know where Catholic University is, but where is that? I was like, oh, it's a culinary school around Rhode Island, and but now I go to Catholic University. And he goes, oh, and I was like, yeah, quite the 180. He was like, no, he said, you went to culinary school to feed people, and now you're feeding souls.
Mm-hmm.
So it
Yeah.
shows that to pursue holiness again is manifest in so many different ways, and manifests itself in different ways, um, as the individual person's realities change
Mm-hmm.
and experiences and situation change, but that God brings good out of all of that.
Right.
And that, this idea that, um, to go in a different direction is somehow some terrible mistake or some dead end. um, if that if that is done with openness
Mm-hmm.
to and open to be receptive to the promptings of the Lord and to Christ, and I have a hard time believing that. And I think, if I can make it from culinary school to being a senior at the Catholic University of America in the
Mm-hmm.
School of Theology and Religious Studies, working at the Catholic Apostolate Center, then it really makes me take a step back and think about how God has continued to call me and how those around me have walked with me to be open to that calling.
Yeah, and that will change over time. I know for myself, moving from different types of pastoral ministry, uh, that will shift and adjust according to our continued growth, and also where we discern where the Lord may be calling us to in terms of particular works within the church, and then there are times where maybe we've discerned that for for many people who may be in pastoral ministry, they might be saying, well, I may be doing apostolate in other ways. Um, so there's a variety of ways I think in which people can discern. I think they get caught and fixed that, oh well, once I make this particular choice, I look at all the different types of ministry that I've done in these last 25 years, that I would have never have thought of. And so the accompaniment of my community, the accompaniment of others, the encouragement of people that I never thought, for example, in the work in collegiate ministry at part time and young adult ministry or teaching at the collegiate level, I never thought that was going to be a possibility, given the what kinds of works we do as a community in my province, and yet the Lord provides that. So it'll be it's always an interesting moving forward. So I think as we look at it, here's one more. How has discerning God's vocation helped in your overall life? Instead of avoiding it, how do you think it has changed your life? And that'll be our last question.
well, I'm here. I
Yeah.
mean, for me, you know, I had this plan in place. I had like this 3 or 4 step plan that I was going to go to culinary school. I was going to go work in restaurants until I either had the money or or experience, probably both, since you need money to own my own restaurant. And I had this plan in place, and it. But a friend of mine said to me, when man makes plans, God laughs,
Mhm.
and that's really true when we make those plans without Him. So, you know, without coming to understand vocation, without coming to understand that as a baptized Christian, that I am called to holiness and to make that manifest in my life in whatever way God is calling me to, um, I wouldn't I wouldn't be here.
Mhm.
Um, so I mean, for me, coming to understand that vocation and working bit by bit every day to both be more open to God and His call for me, uh, in my baptismal vocation to holiness, as well as to discern where He's calling me, in my particular vocation.
Mhm.
It gave my life, like I said, it gave my life that decisive direction, and continues to every day, because again, it's a journey and it's a
Mhm.
process.
I think that's a great way for us to close. Thank you, Brian, for being a part of this webinar. And we'll be providing hopefully a copy of the article that you've written for the National Religious Vocation Conference. We also have a number of resources on vocational discernment at CatholicApostolateCenter.org, as well as the art of accompaniment. So we invite you to go there and take a look at our many resources around these topics. As I said, we will be having additional webinars and we'll let you know that. Follow us on social media as well as sign up for our newsletter and you will learn more. And may the charity of Christ urge us on.